Hi, I'm Leah Toro. This isn't my house. There's a lot going on right now. This video isn't being recorded on my phone like I usually do. It's being recorded like on an actual fucking camera, which is insane. I got the camera because thanks to all of your support, I actually made enough to even get a camera. And I'm very thankful for all of you, all 30,000 of you, for sticking around and helping me do things. But today I bring you something that I always thought was kind of interesting. So on YouTube, there is this like long running battle between commentary YouTubers and, booktubers and the entirety of the romance genre. I feel like romance is one of the things in literature that people don't understand, that it's kind of hard to write. I mean, obviously you're thinking anyone can write a connection between two characters. Oh look, they don't know each other, now they're friends, now they like each other, so on and so forth. But I feel like a lot of people neglect the dynamics and how so many different aspects of the characters play into relationships and making them seem like appeasing and interesting to the masses. And so every time a new romance-focused movie or book comes out, there's like 800 videos posted talking about how shitty the characters are or how shitty the dynamics the characters have are. And that entire like wave, because I grew up watching that kind of content, it's what really got me into the idea of reviewing things on YouTube. Something that I always found interesting about the content people made based off of these shitty books and shitty movies, or shitty movies based off of a shitty book, is the dynamics in the relationships themselves. And so I decided that now, because I have my own YouTube channel, that I would make an entire video breaking down shitty romance dynamics, because I really want to know where things went wrong. And admittedly, it's not a very easy thing to place. My hair is like not doing shit today. I'm so sorry. So a bit of a disclaimer before I really get into this video. Peppered throughout are going to be mentions and discussions of abusive relationships, as well as occasionally some mentions of sexual assault. And if you're sensitive to any of those topics or you consider them triggering for you, I suggest you put your mental health first and just click off the video now. There's probably something else interesting for you to watch. I think everyone is in some way, shape, or form kind of familiar with the romance genre, so I don't need to explain that, but I feel like I should explain this specific phenomenon I see in romantic content, which is the unintentionally abusive relationship. This is an entire category of books and movies in and of themselves, in which the author absolutely started out with the idea that they were going to write this cute, hot drama between two characters, and we get to see their chemistry and their love flourish. But because one of the characters sucks, or because both characters suck in some cases, they end up doing this thing in which they create what is essentially a abusive relationship, like a textbook abusive relationship. But it's all given to the readers under the guise that this is something hot and desirable. It's so hot when you get so mad that he it's so hot when you get so mad that he throws your dog off the balcony. Oh my god, when he throws a tantrum because you didn't text back fast enough, that's so fine. It's not fine. These authors continuously will put this kind of behavior in stories and in their books and in their movies, and everyone else kind of ends up sitting there why would you write a character like this? And then try and tell me that shit's hot. It's not. You can't male manipulate me like that. I'm not a middle schooler anymore. But yeah, essentially it is this entire subgenre that works to glamorize, albeit unintentionally, abusive relationships and kind of push the message to the audience that these behaviors are not only desirable, but that they're swoon-worthy, that this is hashtag goals, you should want this, when in reality it's not. I think some of the bigger infamous examples of this might be arguably Sierra Burgess is a Loser, The Kissing Booth, 365 Days, Twilight, 50 Shades, After, Dante's Inferno, the list goes on. There's so many people who do romance in this really weird toxic boy, girl who can't stay away like way, and I hate it. And so I went digging. And now I bring you, 11 minutes into me recording, Jesus Christ, the pipeline. I think an appropriate place to start this deep dive in the romance genre is the 16th and 17th century, obviously, because imagine this, the radiator has started making sounds. I'm so sorry. Imagine this, it's the 1840s and you are a woman. So we're already off to a scary start. And you grew up with the ideology that your place was in a home. You are a homemaker. You have no skills. You have no, reason to have desires and wants. And you're underestimated at every turn because you are a woman. You are inferior to all the men around you because you are at the bottom of this proverbial food chain. You matter the least in this dynamic. And then one day, whilst you're sitting at home, suddenly a book drops. Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre. I should have looked this up before I started. Jane. It drops. Your world is changed. You have this book dropping about this woman who is completely different from the social norms that you've been raised off of. She speaks up when she feels like she's being injusticed. She perseveres through every hurdle that comes her way. She overcomes challenges. She speaks confidently. She shows courage. She's strong. And sometimes even stronger than the men around her. And whilst she overcomes every single one of the challenges that comes her way, she gets rewarded with all a woman of that century could ever want. A loving husband and family. I want to say that originally, at least from this so far, a big part of romance was focused on wish fulfillment and female empowerment / escapism and inspiration. Because honestly, romance novels work as a kind of mirror of the desires of the time period as well as the desires of the author themselves. It's reflective on what people really wanted in that given point in time. And at that point in time, the most a woman could really ever want is a promising, loving marriage and stability in her life, typically through a man. Not that Jane doesn't find any stability on her own, but a man is kind of a big part of that. There's just a lot of discussion about whether Jane really does count as a female empowerment book because she does still limit herself under the realm of existing in relation to the men around her, but that's besides the point. I do want to point out that Jane as a protagonist does show herself to be strong and courageous and self-confident. She doesn't let things get her down. She doesn't really settle for anything either. She's driven because she knows what she wants and she works to achieve it. And I believe she had 2 love interests in this story. It might have been 3, but I'm pretty sure it was 2. And there was a point in which she actually really sat down and questioned and weighed out the benefits and negatives of choosing either partner because she knew to some degree she would have to compromise on some part of her as a person, and she didn't want to do anything that would make her feel, indignant or that's probably not the word, undignified, or, she didn't have enough power in this relationship. Because to her, it was all about being equal to whoever she was married to. And I thought that was, interesting as shit, because female characters nowadays, they never go with the second option. They never weigh out the positives and negatives of dating the guy who flew across the country to see you and then broke into your house because you said it was over. But even then, whilst Jane does pretty well as a standalone character, I'm pretty sure her final love interest in the book was Rochester. It's acknowledged in the book that he is her superior, societally speaking. He has more money and he has more social status than Jane does, and probably ever will. But regardless, he as a person still has to grow to be with Jane. He has to recognize that things he did prior to them really finalizing their relationship was fucked up, because Jane was originally a mistress because Rochester's current wife at the time was going through some shit, and he's genuinely weaker than she is. I think he's blind. I'm pretty sure he's blind. Can you tell I didn't read the book? He's blind, and that gives Jane some hierarchy over her. He claims that they're equals, but because he's weaker than Jane physically, Jane now has the upper hand in the relationship. Her power, her status is a bit higher than it would typically be in a relationship of the time, which I think is super interesting. So a really shitty wrap-up of the 16th century from that really shitty description I just gave. The focal point and defining features of these novels was a female protagonist who would go through hardships in life, but was then ultimately rewarded with a promising and fulfilling love life and relationship post all of her traumas. Additionally, there's little whispers of female empowerment and defying social convention and being who you are and working confidently and not underestimating yourself solely because of your social status. So we're going to keep that in mind. So skipping ahead to the 20th century, that's when things kind of start exploring the genre of romance more than they already were. Like, we were leaving tradition behind and kind of entering this new era of romance in which people were fusing genres. So prior to this, the entire gothic literature genre was very well established and, flourishing. But this was kind of like the first popular instance of someone mixing both gothic and romantic elements in a novel and like making it a thing. That hand movement was like, okay. And because I honestly think that gothic fiction, a lot of people kind of misunderstand what it is, I want to stress that gothic fiction as a genre is characterized via, I think, Webster's Merriam's Dictionary as, and I quote, a dark, foreboding atmosphere and outlandish, sometimes grotesque characters and events. These stories were typically a male protagonist finding himself at the mercy of terrorizing feats. So, the works. And in 1790, Anne Radcliffe kind of decided that she wanted to give a new perspective on the Gothic genre by introducing a Sicilian romance, which, okay, this book was confusing. I honestly tried to spark notes it, didn't really work out in my favor, and so I just kind of read through things, so my understanding of this book is a little bit fucked. So these Gothic romance stories, at the core of its element was essentially the same as the romance genre in general, in which you'd have a female protagonist defying social convention and going against societal norms in order to really establish themselves as a strong and independent character who's powerful even though she is like a woman. So a pretty big feature of this book was that it's kind of discussed that Radcliffe had really did something when she gave the male characters quote-unquote female traits and vice versa. So essentially our protagonist, Julia, is heroic. She displays heroism that wasn't typically associated with female characters at the time. They were usually kind of meek and small and openly afraid of everything around them, and their brave male counterpart would swoop in to save the day and comfort the frail woman made of glass. And for Julia, that just wasn't the case. She took charge when it came to liberating other female characters and additionally saving her mom. And she was strong and confident and capable. All things that you wouldn't expect from a woman in books of this time. Because it's expected that she would be kind of docile and subservient, but she actively defies all the men in power around her because she's so determined to do specifically what she wants and finds to be in her best interest, which, girl power. Her love interest Ferdinand, on the other hand, that's crazy. He portrays more quote-unquote feminine traits throughout the story. Not that he doesn't have his heroic and brave moments, but a pretty big thing about his character at the time was that he would openly admit to being afraid of the happenings around him. He wasn't quiet about his cowardice because Jesus Christ, the radiator is back on. He wasn't quiet about his cowardice and what he was afraid of, which you wouldn't expect from a male character because they're typically meant to be the heroic motherfuckers, not afraid of anything, will do anything, no questions asked, have no fear, the man is here, kind of guy. But he was afraid of things. He'd say that he was scared. And that just wasn't something you typically see at the time because that totally shatters the macho, alpha, super protective dude bro vibe that most male characters were meant to give off. Okay, so to keep in mind about Gothic romance and then the 16th and 17th century romance put together is that it focuses on a strong female character who looks for true love and doesn't settle for less and aims for equality in their relationships. Male characters that balance both strong and weak traits that allow them to be oppressive force in these women's lives and cements the fact that they can be equality within their relationships and a balance of traits between the two. Now the 70s is where shit gets like freaky deaky. It's where things get a little weird, in my opinion. Well, okay, not weird. So the 70s introduced like a really big turning point in literature. I mean, women were allowed to do things now, like be more than housewives. They could be nurses, and they could be like gay. Whoa. But the 70s primarily introduced a new subgenre of romance known as the Bodice Ripper. They were typically historical fiction-based romances in which our female protagonist would end up kind of catching the eye of this strong, dominant alpha male from the past, whom becomes completely infatuated them for little to no reason at all, and won't take no for an answer when it comes to getting what they want. And I think that sounds a little familiar. But a big thing about these novels, and I mean a big thing, is that they introduced eroticism. Like, they had the goal to put porn on paper. And it wasn't just big because, oh, porn in books, but also big because this was porn that focused on centering female pleasure. Like, prior to this, books didn't really have that kind of stuff in them, but the fact that there was a focus on women feeling good was like crazy, bro. Like, whoa. The novels also, and I'm guessing this kind of comes from the eroticism, played really big into like big dominant guy and small little docile submissive girl, and they usually worked as like an enemies to lovers kind of thing, in which the characters start out butting heads but slowly over time kind of fall for each other and begin to understand and sympathize with one another to the point where they start liking each other romantically, which is perfectly fine. I'm a big enemies to lovers fan. You know, I'm down for a little enemies to lovers. But Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines the entire Bodice Ripper genre as, and I quote, historical or gothic romance typically featuring scenes in which the heroine is subjected to violence. And I'm not gonna lie, she's completely right in that one. Is that a fucking fire truck? Oh my god. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, Merriam-Webster is like 100% right in that definition, because this genre, whilst it introduced some like very interesting things for the entirety of romance for women, I don't know if this is an issue for anyone else, but in these books there was no consent, like none at all. And even if it was there, it was either coercion or like dubious at best, which is like, holy shit, that's like a whole different issue altogether. I think the most prominent example of this is this one novel called The Flame and the Flower, and according to multiple summaries online, it's a story in which the main character is sexually assaulted and then falls in love with her abuser, and it's like painted as genuine love. They're in a relationship and it's supposed to be #goals. It's said to be one of the first prominent examples of the Bodice Ripper, and in later stories meant to follow, you know, in its footsteps for the genre, there was also a continuation of these patterns of characters being abused and assaulted, and then that somehow ending up with them being in a relationship with their abuser. Like, Julie Garwood's The Bride is an entire story in which the main character is like sold to some sexy man without her consent, and then kind of just ends up living with him and calling it a day. You know, it's like a happily ever after. And I'm like, oh my god, they wrote the first I was kidnapped by One Direction fanfiction. And I know what I'm describing is coming off like a little bit of Wattpad, I survived being kidnapped by One Direction like vibes. But you have to understand, this is like what the most of the genre was. Women being headstrong about not wanting to be in a relationship with a man who is completely obsessed with them and demands that they give in and be in a relationship with them. Which might be hot on paper, but sometimes it's not hot on paper. I also feel like it wouldn't be fair of me to mention that these books were also really influenced by like the laws and societal functions of the time. In the 70s, marital rape was not considered a thing. In fact, the word rape wasn't even used till like far later on in the future. So essentially, a person being forced to have sex with their partner because they're married doesn't count as assault or being forced because you're legally binded. And I don't know if you can tell, but the reason books like these were so popular was Sex. But why did I say it like that? It was sex. People liked reading about sex, especially sex that focused on female pleasure, like I said earlier. But I also feel like I should mention that the sex was not enjoyable for the female protagonist until like farther into the book, when the Stockholm Syndrome started to really set in and we had the idea of consent now. So the focus of these stories shifted. Well, not the focus, but kind of the point of these stories shifted, working less as some kind of way to empower women. I guess technically does in some way, blah blah blah, sexual liberation. I'm not a fucking, I don't know, man. I'm not a social commentator. But the focus more or less was shifted in what these books set out to do. It focused less on kind of empowering women and defying gender norms and more of utilizing them to create this fun new experience that you could indulge in on the daily. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit, just a teensy bit. 9/11 shakes America, and also it shakes the soul of a young Gerard Way, who then went on to create pop-punk emo sensational band My Chemical Romance, whom songs in 2007 ended up on the playlist of an even younger Stephanie Myers, who would then go on to write the Twilight Saga, a book which would eventually, Jesus Christ, the Radiator is back, a book which would eventually go on to inspire E.L. James to write her infamous romance novel, 50 Shades of Grey. I'm kind of skipping over Twilight because I think that it being like a YA romance, like it was very much aimed at like prepubescent and teenage girls in the early 2000s with just the everything about the characters. And so for that reason, I'll just be skipping over it because I feel like having to explain and kind of dissect how these tropes are handled in YA romance, it's kind of going to kilter us, it's kind of going to steer us off course because I've been talking about like adult-oriented novels up to this point. So I'm not even joking when I say I think 50 Shades of Grey has to be like the most, if not one of the most infamous romance novels on the market, and unfortunately one of the most influential. So the story of 50 Shades of Grey goes that Anastasia something is this doe-eyed, inexperienced, anxious college girl who ends up having to interview Christian Grey, the CEO, bad boy, sadist, alpha male, who realizes that she is the most manipulatable person on the planet because she is just so inexperienced in comparison to him. And the story really did play into the Bodice Ripper genre because it's just like this poor representation of the BDSM community, followed by Anna getting dick down and dominated like every other chapter. But the book also, because of how like prominent and promiscuous the entire book was, I'm not even gonna say especially for the time, just because of how prominent and promiscuous this book was, it really did go on to inspire a shit ton, like a bunch more of the shitty, abusive romance novels that kind of work as an AU of 50 Shades of Grey. Like, what if Christian Grey was Italian and a teacher with amnesia? Like, what if Christian Grey was in the mafia and kidnaps Anna? Or what if Anna was a well-defined businesswoman, but Dick humbles her or something? I didn't finish the movie that I was referencing. If I went into detail kind of with these books, I'd end up sounding like a broken record, just saying the same thing over and over again, which is why we're going to jump straight into character analysis. Because it's a lot easier to really like hit these cover these characters with more of blanket statements. So, quick recap before we get into this part of the video. Romance in its earlier forms was meant to be both wish fulfillment and some kind of inspiration to its female readers, mirroring issues given at the time, and talking about women who defied social expectations and overcame challenges in their own lives, and were then rewarded for their perseverance with a promising and loving relationship. In the 70s, the introduction of more promiscuous aspects of novels, such as erotica, became more and more popular because it was something that we never really seen before. And so, in order to get the promiscuity of these novels to be more promiscuous and more prominent, a lot of dynamics ended up being explored within these books. Dynamics that usually played pretty heavy on social conventions, as well as really playing into gender roles as a means of creating a very new dynamic that could be really exaggerated solely for the purpose of making interesting erotica. And everything after that kind of became like a mix of both in all three genres, technically to some degree. The male characters in these stories are typically rich and powerful. Their dads are big businessmen with a shit ton of wealth and power, and thus extending that to them. Also giving them a shit ton of power and influence for some reason, even when they don't fucking deserve it, but I digress. Their moms are either absent or like straight up dead, or in some way betrayed their trust, leaving them with some kind of mommy issues or adjacent trauma, with the slight exception of Christian Grey, who had been sexually assaulted, manifesting in trauma that is explored and portrayed differently than the other characters in his genre. They get what they want and they don't feel like they can or ever will be told that they can't do something. They're prone to outburst, overreactions, have anger issues, they're possessive and protective, and like to male manipulate in their free time. And they all hate other women because they just are never satisfied with them. And they consistently believe that all the other men in the main characters' lives are either trying to take them away or are rapist, in which they are usually proven right, but I'll get more into that later. The female characters in these stories are often subservient and submissive, either totally inexperienced in general, or inexperienced with the lifestyle of the male character that they are forced into or introduced to. They have the Bob the Builder, we can fix it attitude, and work as the rock to the male character. But they also act as the emotional and sometimes physical punching bag, standing by the love interest through thick and thin of their relationship. Additionally, these characters are separated from family, either pre-love interest or by force post-love interest. Bonus points if she has any male companions or co-workers whom she sees as friends, because she's naive to their true intentions until they try and assault her for some reason. A lot of these stories, I really do feel like, play really hard into the good girl, bad boy, like, dynamic between characters. And the entire, like, purpose of the trope, I'm sorry, is to make you feel special. Like, that's the whole thing. Bad boys are famous for being stoic and mysterious, kind of like a puzzle that you've lost the box for. He is essentially made untouchable due to his trauma-forged shield and cold demeanor, being self-centered and focused more on fulfilling his own desires rather than forging any meaningful connections because he's either scared or doesn't prioritize them enough in his life. And every bitch in the world wants to capture the giant red flag. Their refusal to forge relationships mean that these, like, alpha male hardasses are like an exclusive club. Few people can really get in, and everyone knows, because for some reason everyone has tried to fuck him, that it's very difficult to end up in that character's good graces, and thus, if you happen to be one of the select few who end up even being remotely tolerated by him, that's a luxury, and you should be holding on to that, because they are a luxury that you can afford. So the main character, and by extension the reader, is special because she didn't choose him, he chose her. And she's never even all that. Like, she's barely competent and kind of just stumbles around life and goes with the flow. And people are like falling, dropping dead for her because she's just that good. And it's like, damn. Jesus. And the issue with bad boys isn't that they're like cold and stoic or whatever, because I can't even shit on them like that. But it's just the abuse that the main character withstands at the hands of this guy that makes the entire, like, trope and genre just feel really gross to me. The abuse ranges from physical to sexual. In very few cases, at least as far as I'm concerned, there have been books where the love interest will outright, like, hit and threaten the life of the main character. It's hard to make that hot somehow. There typically will be, like, times throughout the book where the main character ends up being in, like, situations where sexual acts are initiated without her consent. Like, she's either a little tipsy and you can't have sex with someone who's been drinking because they are not of right mind, and additionally they're often done by the love interest as a means of stopping the female character from getting away from them or denying their love, because if she gives in, then that's essentially her saying, yes, I have feelings for you all along. Which, holy shit. So essentially, she's either A, worn down to the point where she is just agreeing to do things because she doesn't have the energy to say no anymore. She has some other responsibility to fulfill that forces her to be in consistent contact with the love interest, or the love interest is in some position in which he can insert himself into her life, whether she likes it or not, and thus forcing them to be into close contact. And even when the sex is consensual, there will be moments where just like sexual boundaries and trust are broken by the male protagonist to show that he just has no regard for her feelings or her safety and even what she wants. And there's kidnapping and in some cases like literal grooming happening in these stories, but it's it's fine because the guy is hot and the girl wants him, so in the end it's all okay. So because romance in of itself works as a kind of wish fulfillment, I'm of the belief that the male characters in these stories aren't just like this because they had to exaggerate the characters' traits to make them more prominent in the story, but also as a means of tackling any kind of insecurities that the person might have when thinking about a relationship. The goal is essentially for the reader to be rewarded with some semblance of a fulfilling and wonderful relationship. So the love interest has to tick off as many boxes as possible to be the universal, perfect sexy man. And in doing so, it just ends up making something sort of terrifying. Aside from, physical attractiveness, muscles, being tall, dark, and handsome, fun fact, apparently the phrase tall, dark, and handsome means like you have dark features, which I don't understand. I always thought it just meant like melanated. They're not swayed by the evil temptation that is other women, because reminder, they hate all women but you. Not to mention, they have some relatively good qualities, like money, a genuine desire to be around you, possessiveness, which, okay, that's cute, that's hot, until, those traits are used for evil and or are cranked up to 11 for no fucking reason. Like, yeah, a wealthy spouse sounds cool. It's someone who can spoil you and take you out to fancy dinners and buy you everything you could ever want. But it becomes significantly less sexy when that economic gap is held over your head as a means of keeping you in line because, remember, he has more money and more power than you. Or using the fact that he has so much money to spare as a means of manipulating you to do what he wants. And, possessiveness and that need to feel needed is like, I see the vision. But, being forced away from your friends and family so this guy can have total control of your life, showing up out of nowhere because you didn't text back in exactly 2.7 seconds, or, threatening to kill every man that comes within a 20-mile radius of you, is like a little less, I don't see the vision anymore. Suddenly I'm blind. Suddenly it's kind of hard to see. And I kind of mentioned this a bit earlier in the video, but there is also this fascinating issue where for some reason every other male character in the female characters' lives is just some like decrepit creature who just wants to sleep with her and will like end up attempting essentially to sexually assault her just at the drop of a hat, and it's so fucking weird. Like, genuinely, it's so fucking strange. Because, you're introduced to this. It doesn't happen in every single one, but I've seen it enough times for me to like just really have to stop and think about it. Because what they do is that they present you with what is essentially looks like a better option in comparison to the love interest. Like, oh, this guy looks promising. But because the love interest and the main character are meant to be endgame, they don't want readers kind of straying too far off the path. And so they'll do this whole thing where the female character's like, okay, I'm gonna go hang out with my friend now, my male friend and or coworker. And then she goes to hang out with them and they attempt to sexually assault her. Or like just like genuinely assault her in some way, shape, or form. And then the guy swoops in, he's like, see, I told you. And so he protects her from this cruel and unjust world. And she really is the only guy that he can trust. And before the accusations start fucking flying, I'm not trying to be the purity police and trying to burn down your fucking books or whatever. I understand that these books need conflict, and additionally, that these books are mainly erotica and carry the same levels of realism that you'd see in a poorly acted porno. The exaggeration of these characters, though I'm skeptical of the idea that this is on purpose, is for creating an enhanced and elevated experience. Trying to ground these stories in reality poses obvious roadblocks, like people pointing out that something in a relationship isn't healthy, or male characters not sucking as much as they do. Things need to be subverted and remixed if the characters are supposed to prosper in this relationship. So, giving you, the reader, this whimsical escape into this hot reality where everything is a little strange and uncanny if you think about it for a second too long, which is what I did in this video, because I like to talk about things. I'm also not saying that these books are bad solely because they contain questionable dynamics between the characters. I'm genuinely all for the exploration of topical and honestly like taboo and not too good things in stories. I feel like it's a very interesting perspective to have, and it's not like it's something that's never been done before. And it just really depends on how it's done. Because there are like romance novels and stories that exist where the characters in question have some like you kind of side-eye the dynamic they have, but you can still like look past that and enjoy the story because it's done in a certain way, or just because you like it more than others. Really, it just depends. It's a case-by-case basis. But the case with these stories is that I feel like they fall flat, not just because the characters suck ass, but because of what they intended to do and how that ended up. So I briefly mentioned earlier in this video how abusive romance kind of functions as this unintentionally created genre in which an author will be like, yeah, I'm gonna write a romance story. Everything in this book is romantic and positive, and is something that is like to strive for in a relationship. But then they end up writing this like really gross and abusive character, but still painting them in a good light for the sake of it being a romance. And I have to stress that the key word is unintentional. There's a difference between psychological and even thriller stories that center around a deplorable relationship and a romance that centers on a deplorable relationship but is trying to convince us that it's #goals. Hi, so I didn't film an outro because my camera just like straight up died and I didn't get a chance to do it, but for my end notes, I do just want to say that the issue with these stories, it boils down that everything the characters do, no matter how abusive and forceful it is and just how like genuinely awful the actions are, not just in reference to the story, but in reference to their character and character development, like literally doesn't matter because the author's so hell-bent on having you think that this is good for the character and good for the story and good for the relationship, which is why it sucks ass. I think that most stories that feature these tropes and such obviously exist because people enjoy them. There are people who obviously understand that these aren't things to strive for, but seeing the power dynamic or just seeing this specific weird trope thing is what people really enjoy because they understand that on paper it's okay, and then in real life it would be like a totally different story. But that doesn't really take away from the fact that fundamentally these characters suck and fundamentally these relationships suck, which is why me and so many other people like to criticize them because because once again, they suck. If anything, I just say that if you want to read these stories, like if these butter your biscuit or whatever, they're your guilty pleasure, do what you want. I don't really care. I'm just pointing and laughing at these relationships because they're funny to point and laugh at, and the dynamics between them are all the same and just like different variations of bad. But you know, whatever floats your boat, dude. Okay, I still don't have an outro, so bye.